Chapter 4. We hadn't been on the road long before Jerry asked me to fill him in on my reasons for taking this trip. Was it my imagination, or did the ears of the two men in the front seat actually move like those on a horse rotating towards my voice? I have a powerful imagination. I'm having trouble with I'm having trouble with the book I'm writing, I told my friend. Tonsillary breakfast condom. Jerry wanted to get it straight. That's right. I patted my bag. The manuscript was inside. I always write my stuff out in hand and then type it up later. Well, what's the problem? I sighed. I'm just a little unsure of the direction I want to take. Like what? Well, I don't know if I want to be autobiographical or absurdist. I don't know if I want to try to write all one big narrative or continue as I have done in the past with hundreds of tiny interconnected stories. And it's more than that. I don't know if writing is really what I want to do. I mean, I'm going to continue writing, but should it really be the focus of my efforts? Should it be number one? As opposed to your painting, you mean? Well, there's that, but then there's my music too. I've always wanted to have a band. At this point, Alex Brigade desperately wanted to tell me how he'd always wanted to be in a band too, and that he hadn't, even at this late age, given up on the dream. But the barriers between employee and employer and my manner of setting definite boundaries around myself inhibited him, so he said nothing. I'm sorry I can't help you there. Jerry shook his head. Jerry's a good friend and the best psychic in the world. He's useful for many things, but as an imaginary person, he is barred by the laws of the universe from participating in a musical career. I know, I reassured him that it was all right. But anyway, I've got to get some direction. Got to get my head straight on this matter. This is life we're talking about here. And you think visiting the Perfectual will help you find direction? Yes. I was resolved about this issue. I had thought about it for a long time, and I was determined to go. And how exactly does that work? What is it about the Perfectual that will give you direction, motivation, inspiration, and so forth? I looked out the window at the countryside. I'd never been through here before. I wondered about the houses we passed. Who lived in them? What did they look like on the inside? What was under the bed in the spare room? Did they have an old clue game in the closet? I dreamed it, I told Jerry. Not just once, but twice. At least twice. I know exactly what it's going to be like when we get there, and I know that going there is going to give me the answers I need to complete my book, my novel, and complete it to my satisfaction. Jerry nodded his head in acceptance of my words. Do you think I could read what you've got so far? He asked. I was delighted at the prospect. I started to get out the manuscript. Or better yet, Jerry added, why don't you read some of it aloud? You read so well. He has a fantastic voice, he told Alec in Seville. Sure, if you like. I was happy to do it, although to tell the truth, I would have enjoyed it more to hear someone else read my stuff aloud. I always got a new perspective on my words when they came out of another's mouth. I write in a spiral notebook. I flipped back to the beginning and scanned the first lines. I cleared my throat and began to read. I love me some proper grammar. Blake Mathers, a big man with a big beard, was the editor of The Umbrella, a free weekly newspaper covering the cultural life in a small college town. After an evening at the yacht club, the only bar in town where you could carry on a conversation at normal speaking volume, he had accepted the invitation of Angelica, a graduate student at the college, to see the dioramas he had built into the walls of her house. She drove him there in her tiny yellow car. This makes me think of something Annie Hall would drive, Pleat observed from his cramped seat. The floorboard was covered with trash, and the back seat was full of papers, books, and a potted plant that looked surprisingly healthy. Who? Angelica asked. Annie Hall. Woody Allen movie. Oh, Woody Allen. Yeah. Annie Hall. Angelica nodded vigorously. She was about an inch shy of 6 feet, with lank blonde hair that looked like it needed slightly more maintenance. She wore no makeup but something around the eyes that was so subtle that Pleat didn't realize it until just now as the light from a street light passed through the car. He was debating if he should make some comment on her looks, which he favorably compared to a combination of Heather Thomas and some sort of rural hippie chick, when Angelica announced, "This is it," and turned into her drive. I've been by here before, Pleat enthused. I've seen this house before. Well, now you can see the inside. Angelica switched off the engine. Do you own? Pleat asked, getting out. She didn't lock her door, so he didn't lock his. No, I rent. The house was an old mill shack, company housing built in the early part of the century for people who had exhausted the pension fund before Angelica was born. Some developer had bought them all and renovated them with the student population in mind. Each house was painted a different color. Indoor toilets had been installed, and the exposed stone columns that held up the floor had been concealed with vinyl cladding. The tiny porch was almost completely occupied by a hammock. Pleat's legs held it sideways while he waited for Angelica to open the door. Pleat had barely stepped inside before he found that Angelica was explaining the first of the dioramas. "You see," she said, pointing, "it's a man and his dog. Going for a walk," Pleat noted with a grin. "That's really neat." Pleat avoided using the word cool. The diorama was inside an 8x5 by 7-inch box set into the wall, covered over by a sheet of framed plexiglass and lit from within by a tiny electric bulb. The figures in their setting were constructed of painted papier-mâché, strips of cloth, and torn pieces of cardboard. These materials were throughout the dioramas, including nails, tacks, yard debris, old spools, and found objects of all types. The hallway that ran through the house from the front door straight to the back had 7 dioramas. Each room had several. There was even one that took the place of the window in the living room. This was larger and more elaborate than the others. "It's the Battle of Roman's Tit," Angelica explained. "It's amazing," Pleat told her. "And you did this in a rented house? What do you think the landlord will say?" She shrugged her shoulders. "I don't care. He can do what he likes with them when I'm out, but I've got a feeling he'll keep them." She looked about her. "I can see this place becoming a famous sight in town, some place everybody's heard of and wants to see." "Well, I'm impressed." Pleat looked down at the young woman and smiled. "You haven't seen everything yet," Angelica cried. "You haven't seen the ones in my room." Pleat made a thoughtful face and followed her to her room. It was a tiny space, but it contained a spaceship crashing, a Browning muscle mass, 900 pounds on sticky wheels, and the orgasm of Count Barry, an homage to the burial of Count Orgaz. "You know," Pleat told Angelica, "these remind me of a similar diorama-type installation at the old Sashiro's." "Sashiro's? What's that?" "It was a pizza place on Fleming Street. It's gone now. Torn down." Angelica chuckled. "You've been in this town a long time." "Do I seem like an old man to you?" Pleat mockingly growled, grabbing the woman by her arms and drawing her closer to him. "With that mountain man beard," she laughed. Pleat leaned down to kiss her. "Is it a problem?" he asked. "Well..." Angelica began some joking retort which was never completed, as the spirit of Pleat's father, Merle, appeared suddenly in the room. "What are you doing with this girl, Pleat?" The spirit, attired in the costume of a square dancer, cowboy shirt and neckerchief, thundered. "What the hell?" Angelica screamed, twisting about to hide behind Pleat's bulk. "What are you doing with this girl in her bedroom?" the spirit demanded, placing such loathsome emphasis on the word bed that Pleat recoiled with vicarious nausea. "What are you doing here?" Pleat shouted, noting with rising revulsion the old man's fleshy-lipped sneer, so familiar in his recollection. He saw the bizarre, cartoon-heavy outlines of white and black about his father's washed-out figure and knew that he was a ghost. "What are you doing here?" he repeated. "You're not dead." I took a sip of water from a bottle I had brought with me and cleared my throat. "Shall I continue?" I asked, as much of everybody in the car as Jerry. Just a minute." Jerry held up a finger. "What was the name of that story again?" "Well," I drawled, "technically it's not a story, but a segment from my novel, but if one wanted, one could extrapolate it as a standalone piece. But anyway," I said, turning back a couple of pages, "it's called I Love Me Some Good Grammar." "And, what does that have to do with the, segment of your novel?" "Nothing," I answered, after pretending to muse on the idea for a moment. "Nothing at all." Jerry accepted this with a nod. "And one more thing. If you don't intend for that to be a story, why does it bear a title unto itself?" "Jerry," I took a deep breath, "it's an homage to my earlier work." In Alec's imagining, the renovated mill shack took on the appearance of a children's playhouse with a fuzzy photograph of a sunny day at the park outside the calico-curtained windows to suggest a realistic setting for such a playhouse as he now entered with his old girlfriend, Bonita. "What do you think?" she asked. "I think it's better than your mom's place," Alec answered truthfully. Bonita's mother lived in a pathetic dump that my mother would have characterized as a nigger shack in her quaint way. "She's doing the best she can," Bonita immediately took offense. Her mother could flatten a puppy's head at a White House press conference, and still Bonita would tolerate no criticism of her. Criticism, that is, from others. Bonita herself could criticize her all she wanted. Okay, Alec threw up his hands. He looked about the place. It was basically a one-room dwelling with a loft to sleep in. I say basically it was one room because obviously there was a bathroom somewhere, although Alec couldn't immediately spot it. And there was a door in the far wall that, when opened, led not to the phony outside, but a small void from whence sprang Alec's father. "What are you doing here?" Alec shouted. "You're not dead." "No, but I've come with ghostly powers to stop you from making a terrible mistake." Alec's father looked meaningfully at Bonita as the latter went about the little house, marking the walls where she intended to install her dioramas. "It's a great idea," she said to herself. "I can make one of them a tribute to David Lee Roth. Hey, Alec, what's that thing they keep things related to a saint in?" "A reliquary," Alec told her. He kept his eyes on his father. "It'll work out," he said to himself. "If I get my act together, it can work out." By getting his act together, Alec meant focusing on his schoolwork and being more the kind of person Bonita would want him to be by the time their relationship would fall apart. "Well, maybe it can." Alec's father slapped his hands together and dropped his intended project. He sat down on the sofa that seemed to fill almost the entirety of the room. One could turn the knobs on the little play stove in the corner without getting up. "Did I ever tell you about the time I built a latrine out of discarded supplies?" he asked. Alec and Bonita sat opposite him on the top of the coffee table, their backs to the unseen TV. Bonita seemed fascinated by the idea of the old man's Vietnam anecdote. "I think I've heard this story," Alec gently reminded his father. "Well, maybe Bonita hasn't heard it." "I don't care if this slut has heard it," Alec jumped up and yelled. "To hell with both of you." The scene ended with Alec machine-gunning his girlfriend and his father to death as they sat entwined on the sofa, kissing. Garlic or Gibbon would have handled it differently, Alec told himself as he took a deep breath and refocused his attention on the road. Clarksville observed him closely. He had been trained in the interpretation of body language and knew that some powerful emotions or disturbing thoughts had just passed through the young man. Oh well, as long as he continued to drive satisfactorily. "Sir," Seville addressed himself to me. "Don't say sir," I reminded him. "Right," Seville acknowledged. "Do you mind if I comment on your writing?" "No, go ahead." "Well, if it's all right, I wouldn't mind hearing some more." "Me too," Alec jumped in. "Sure." I flipped a couple of pages. "Surrounded by asterisks and copyright bubbles." "What's your book about?" Angelica asked Pleat Mathras. Pleat drew his beard through her big but surprisingly soft fist. He and Angelica lay on her bed. A ring of white Christmas tree lights strung about the crown molding was the only illumination aside from the light atop the fish tank. The residents of this tank were mechanical, requiring only a spoonful of physic acid to be added to the water once a week to keep them activated. The octopus was named Negromium, and the trout was named Acetylena. "It's a compilation of legends about homegrown Malone," Bleat replied. "You've heard of homegrown Malone?" "I've heard the name. There was something in the paper about it." "He was a real person. Or should I say monster?" Pleat gazed up at the ceiling. Angelica had tacked or taped hundreds of pictures cut out of magazines up there. How she reached it, he had no idea. It was such a high ceiling that even he couldn't reach it was standing on the bed. Not that he had tried, but he was good at such estimations. That was partly how he knew not to reveal to Angelica or anyone just yet that this book was about more than just homegrown Malone. It was to be about many of the people he knew and had met in town. "What's the title?" Angelica asked. Pleat sighed. "That's a good question," he admitted. "I got a couple of ideas in mind." "'Cause a good title is important," Angelica reminded him. "Yes, I know. The one I'm thinking about using right now is Solar Molar Mortar Sorter." "Do what?" Solar Molar Mortar Sorter." "Is it something to do with homegrown Malone?" Angelica's brow wrinkled like a flexi straw. "No." Pleat sounded confused that she would even ask that. "Is this to be a subjective history of homegrown Malone?" "Ah, very good." Pleat rolled over slightly to face the woman. "You understand that a jokey title indicates that the author is going to inject a bit of his own personality into the book. It means you're not taking your subject seriously. Well, I'm not going to call it the history of homegrown Malone, a local legend. God, no. People might know what the book was about." "Well," Pleat sighed, "another possible title is Oral Dog Slipper." "You're just being absurd for the sake of being absurd." Angelica said this with such exasperation, such obvious disdain for the ridiculous, that Pleat's estimation of her began to slip. Clearly, she was an interesting person with a narcissistic bent. She had her own sense of the absurd. That much was clear from some of the scenarios in her dioramas. Did she have some aesthetic objection to a willful dissonance between a work of art and its title? How foolish! Pleat sighed again, this time dismissively, and rolled onto his back. He intertwined his fingers on his chest. "Do you prefer black and white episodes of the Andy Griffith Show to the color ones?" Pleat asked after a couple of minutes. He really couldn't think of anything else to say and thought he'd better say something. "I don't know," Angelica shook her head. "I've never heard of it." I had ended the story there, feeling that the average reader should be able to infer Pleat's disgust at someone who has no knowledge of the Andy Griffith Show. I looked at the two men in the front seat. When Andy Griffith died, Alec had mentioned the news to a couple of his co-workers, expecting them to share his disdain for this entertainer from an earlier, cheesier era. He had been surprised at their reactions. They liked Andy Griffith. I saw Alec turn his head slightly to glance at Seville in hopes of catching his eye, and perhaps sharing a telepathic snicker. But Seville, whose thoughts were on a particularly unrealistic episode of Salvage 1 he'd happened to see several years before, offered no interaction. No more chapters. Clark Seville had no time for television. His devotion to a minute-to-minute engagement with life would have left little room for such passive entertainment, even if he weren't insulted by the majority of television's content. There were occasions, however, when he was forced by circumstances to be subjected to broadcast mediocrity. At such times he amused himself by mocking both what he saw and the level of mind that would willingly sit through such trash. Tonight he sat in a hotel room with another agent, Damon Michaels, passing the time until the third member of the group, Oscar Meringue, returned. Michaels, sitting on one of the two beds, had politely asked Seville if he minded the TV being on. Seville had not objected, but after nearly 45 minutes of advertisements interspersed among the witless adventures of a trio of Hollywood stereotypes, he couldn't take it any more. With politeness equal to his colleagues, he excused himself and entered the bathroom. There he sat on the toilet and leafed through his meditation helper, a small book of evocative pictures. Such books are called image books by followers of Dead Man's Freedom, a philosophical school to which Seville had been tenuously attached for a couple of years now. Seville was too suspicious of mass movements and collectives, even small fringe ones like Dead Man's Freedom, to commit formally to one. Still, he had read up on the organization and its methods and aims and liked what he found. He had perused the materials for sale at the regional headquarters and then created for himself his own version of one of the official image books. Whereas the official ones might contain pictures of zebras, yachts, and old women tilling the soil, Seville's contained random segments of pages from old magazines, torn out and taped together in discordant collages. He was determined to hammer out his own path, his own brand of Dead Man's Freedom. He focused on one page at a time, watching his breathing, observing his own act of observing. The sounds of the TV in the other room diminished in his consciousness until they were unintelligible. Clark Seville had been performing this ritual for a couple of years. Although he had only his own feelings to go by, he believed that it increased his ability to concentrate. This was the second image book he had constructed. The first he had so thoroughly memorized that the pictures had begun to form a strange kind of narrative to him. He suspected that this would diminish the image's power and had started over with a new one. Now the same thing was happening with this book, but this time he was staying with it to see what happened. As he turned to the page of the piece of a mom running horse-legged over oceans of lip spill, he was jerked out of his meditative state by the sound of Oscar Meringue's code knock on the hotel room door. As Seville stepped out of the bathroom, he met Michaels, also in the act of responding to the knock. They exchanged looks. Seville nodded to Michaels to look through the peephole. The latter did so and confirmed Meringue's presence on the other side with a nod. "Outside the banana brush in 1 hour," Meringue informed his fellow agents once he was inside the room. "The banana brush," Seville repeated. "It's some sort of nightclub on Park Wamper, 2 streets over," Meringue explained. "I knew this hotel was a good choice," commented Michaels. "We don't have far to walk." "Or to wait," Seville added. He was checking his weapon and retying his shoes. We should go there at once and watch." "Now wait a minute," Meringue glanced at Michaels as he began talking. "We've got an hour. No need to jump the gun." Michaels agreed. He said so, eyes drifting toward the TV as he did. Seville looked from Meringue to Michaels, the latter already transfixed by the action on the screen and back. I know why he wants to stay. Seville jabbed his finger at Michaels as he addressed the third man. But what about you? Is there a very special episode of Father Knows His Three Sons that you're looking forward to? The big man's tone was unusually sarcastic, bordering on emotional. Father knows his three sons, Meringue repeated, his mouth sour, his eyebrows wrinkled in confusion. Michael, sitting on the bed, spared Seville a sideways look. Jesus, that's been off the air for years, he said with contempt. Although I had owned a saxophone for some time, I hadn't gotten far in its mastery. It was my concrete belief that I could teach myself anything. Therefore, I had not only not sought out a teacher, but had also limited the amount of instructional literature to which I exposed myself. I only wanted the basics. I didn't want to learn to play Mary Had Little Lamb or go through the trouble of learning to read music again. None of that was necessary if you just wanted to play solos over the top of your favorite records, Sade, Bad Company, James Brown, etc. My heroes on the saxophone were Joe Henderson, Wayne Shorter, and Archie Shepp. When I heard them play, I knew that I must join their elite fraternity. To that end, and in order to save time, I decided to get back into smoking pot. Under its influence, I could learn to play the saxophone the way a child learns to speak a language, intuitively, somnambulistically. The trouble was now to obtain a large enough supply. I hadn't smoked in years. My old dealer was dead. The best weed in town comes from Homegrown Malone, an acquaintance told me. Homegrown Malone? I snickered, saying the name aloud. Who's that? The acquaintance, a man in the uniform of a hobby railroad enthusiast, looked uneasily at the bowl of ceramic fruit on the coffee table between us. He's a thing. He looked into my eyes as if testing them for fear as much as credulity. Seeing nothing apparently but my unflappable good nature, he went on. Homegrown Malone is a half-human monster living in an old dilapidated house out in the woods. A half-human monster, I repeated. Woods? Does it sound like a comic book? The railroad man smiled. He was an older fellow, white-haired and sun-cracked. Well, I demurred. Everything was a comic book to me, but I didn't want to tell him that. I thought it was just a legend, too, when I first heard it. He picked up his cup of coffee from the low table. But I've been out there, and let me tell you that is some happy weed. His gaze was as serious as a Vietnam vet telling you about some old man he had killed just for the fun of it. I can believe that, I told him, but half human, half monster? The thing about Homegrown Malone is that he's sort of a proselytizer for pot. He doesn't grow it to get rich. He wants to spread the word. Usually he doesn't even want money. Now I knew my locomotive acquaintance was, as my father said to me when I was a child, telling me a story. I nodded, playing along. And what is his preferred unit of exchange? You don't believe me? Not really. I saw no reason to be nice. I'd never see this guy again. I think he was only at the party because of his strong resemblance to Richard Widmark, appealed to our host's sense of nostalgia. I'll take you there right now. He slapped his knees and pushed himself up. You haven't finished your coffee, I pointed out. I think I still remember how to get there. How do you know this guy's still alive? A creature like Homegrown Malone doesn't age like you or me. I was still puzzling over whether the hobby engineer should have said you or I as we drove out to the wooded area outside of town, known locally as the Woods. I was behind the wheel. The older man, whose name it turned out was Gober, sat beside me, directing my driving. Just a little further, he said, leaning expectantly forward, work-swollen index finger bouncing in the air as it indicated some half-remembered destination somewhere up ahead. There's a little turnoff on the right in the middle of a field. I know it's still there because I saw it a couple of years ago. Gober chewed his left thumbnail without actually biting off any of it. A couple of years ago, I repeated. How long has it been since you've been to this guy's place? Oh, long time. Gober didn't seem interested in answering my questions. As we drew nearer to our goal, he became more and more nervous. Is this it? I pointed to a field of what looked like sorghum on the right. I'm no farmer, and it was night, but still there was something about the crop that made me think sorghum. Maybe. Yes, this is it. Slow down now. Look for a little trail. The little trail turned out to be easy to spot. This is it? I demanded incredulously. Beside a well-traveled dirt road through the field stood a hand-painted sign reading Homegrown Malone's Crafts and Gifts. Why would he advertise? Gober wondered. We were idle in the middle of the road. Is this it or not? I asked. Gober fumbled for an answer. This is it, but I don't understand. Why? Do you want to go there or not? Only my craving for a pot, which had been building for the past hour and a half to the point that I was now remembering all the sensations attendant on a smoking experience, had kept me on this road, and now I was willing to believe anything in connection with obtaining some, even that a run-down junk shop in the woods was a good source. I guess so, my passenger decided. I've got to see what's happened. You think they'll be open? I asked as I turned my car into the open road. It used to not matter what time of day you came out here. Gober looked out the windows at the fields around us like a kid expecting to see lions. We drove along the narrow road for some time, probably as long as 4 or 5 minutes. There was nothing to either side of us but crops. And then, as the field sloped suddenly downward, there in front of us were the woods. The road continued into the middle of them. Straight ahead, Gober told me. He was tense now, licking his old man's lips and holding onto the dashboard with both hands. I had to drive slowly. The road was bumpy. Trees stood close on either side. It was a typical southern pine forest. The undergrowth was thin honeysuckle and the occasional Russian olive. The road continued to slope downhill. How swampy is it down here? I asked. I don't want to get stuck. Gober didn't reply for a few seconds. It's pretty swampy down below the house, but you should be okay this side of it. He inhaled sharply. I saw it too. Lights ahead of us. The illuminated windows of a house seen intermittently through the trees. Should we stop here and just walk the rest of the way? I asked Gober. No. He seemed to be weighing the options. Nowhere to turn around. There should be a place to park in front of the house. I drove on. We came within 100 feet of the house. From what I could see, it was a tiny cylinder block dwelling surrounded by weeds and junk of a predominantly agricultural nature. Lots of galvanized tin and threadbare tires. Is this like you remember? Gober took a breath. It's exactly like I remember. Are we getting out? Gober tugged on the bill of his engineer's cap. Sure we are, he manfully asserted. For a brief moment he even sounded like Richard Woodmark, but that impression dissipated as he began fumbling with the door handle. How do you work this thing? I reluctantly shut off the engine and switched off the lights. Outside the car, the air was cool and damp. You could smell the mold. I followed Gober across the ground, you couldn't call it a yard, to the door set without the accompaniment of porch or any other kind of framing details in the front of the house. Gober knocked. I craned my neck trying to look into one of the windows without stepping into or onto anything, but only the buttery yellow glow showed. Around us was nothing but the sounds of frogs and insects. I could hear nothing from inside the house. It was a shock when the door was almost immediately opened in response to my companion's knock. The yellow light flooded the doorway. The saxophone is a noble instrument, homegrown Malone opined. He reached into the bookcase behind him and withdrew a heavy volume. What I can't get over, Gober said once again, is how everything, especially the smell in here, is exactly the same. Homegrown Malone, who had already responded to the first couple of remarks of this nature that Gober had made, only continued to thumb through the book. He sat in the middle of an old sofa, set in the heart of the cluttered room. Around him were piles of boxes, and behind him the floor-to-ceiling bookcase. Gober and I sat on chairs facing the sofa. Only a tiny space was free between our respective knees. A narrow path led through the clutter to the other parts of the house on either side of us. Although thinking about it now, I don't see how there could have been much more to that house than that room. That's just one of the confusing things about that night. After entering the house, it became like a dream. Homegrown Malone found the page he was looking for and passed the book to me. True to Gober's description, he was a half-man, half-monster. He was like a primitive boar, no neck and a wide, undershot mouth. He wore a voluminous garment resembling a sack. My memories are hazy, however. He could just as easily have been that southern rarity, a hick with intellectual interests. He'd hardly be a hick then, would he? Jerry later objected as I told the story to him. Person of rural derivation, then, I suggested in response to his objection. Whatever homegrown Malone was, he persuaded me that I didn't need any marijuana to help me learn to play the saxophone. The picture he showed me was of Scrawny Prep, the great Irish tenorman whose devotion to sober thinking is more known than his playing. And what happened to Gober? Jerry asked. I don't know, I told him. I didn't notice he was missing until the next day. I shrugged my shoulders. Maybe homegrown Malone ate him.